welcome. Because it is a small group, I think we really can have a very informal discussion, and after our presenters make their remarks, and I know Marianne will raise some questions with them, but after that I'm hoping we can just have a pretty informal conversation and talk to each other as regular people. So let me do my introduction thing. Well, you're sitting next to me, so I'll introduce you first. Mr. Barkley, Charles Barkley, is Manager of Financial Risk at the New York City Office of the Comptroller's Bureau of Asset Management, except he's also about to be shipped off to, already he's doing his Coast Guard work as a commissioned officer in the Coast Guard. But let me talk a little bit about his controller work first. He's Manager of Financial Risk, which is a complicated and interesting job where he's supposed to manage, analyze, and report all aspects and factors of financial risk for the New York City's combined pension assets, which is, if you ever worked or plan to work for New York City government, it's very important, because if that money isn't managed properly, you got to worry about your pension when you retire. So it's important. Mr. Barkley got his MBA from Fordham in 2008, but his MPA here just last year, and of course is a Pi Alpha Alpha student or graduate, as you would be. Let me see, in the Coast Guard he was assigned to the Sector New York's Enforcement Division. He's the Assistant Ports, Waterways, and Coastal Security Officer and liaison to Coast Guard Headquarters, Port Resilience for Operational Tactical Enforcement to Combat Terrorism. It's all those words because it spells protect with the acronym.
It's got to be an acronym.
Yeah. And he's now assigned to Long Island Sound Logistics and Finance Division in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm going to introduce Mr. Martinez too, and then you two can flip a coin to decide who goes first. Mr. Martinez is Director of Field Operations for the New York City Board of Correction. And he actually joined the City Board of Correction just 3 months before getting his MPA and the Inspector General program here. Supervises the Field Operations Unit, and that's a unit that makes sure that the Department of Corrections is itself obeying the law, basically, in terms of the legal requirements for standards of confinement, so they're not doing awful things to inmates and so forth. Mr. Martinez started in public service as an interviewer for the New York City Criminal Justice Agency. Although it's called an agency, it's actually not a city agency. It's a private, not-for-profit group. But what you do there is decide which people who've been arrested are eligible for release on their own recognizance. So he was interviewing people. We generally don't start off with the easiest jobs. He was assigned to the midnight shift at Queens Central Booking, which I'm sure was delightful.
And tough.
Yeah. But only a year later, he was promoted to supervise all the pre-arraignment operations at Queens Criminal Court and Manhattan Criminal Court for part of the time as well. 2000, he joined the Queens DA's office, representing District Attorney Dick Brown at community meetings, and created summer recreational and summer employment opportunities in the Rockaway Peninsula, where I happened to grow up. I wasn't in his programs, but I grew up there. Developed the Summer Youth Employment Program for Rockaway High School students, and in 2003 helped create something called Rockaway Men United, a minority male mentoring initiative for Rockaway High School I went to. Later copied by programs in other schools in the 106th, 101st, and 113th precinct. So that's who we have tonight, and I am personally very pleased that they can be here, and I have a feeling you're going to find their remarks and insights valuable. So, should we flip a coin because you start first, or leave it up to you?
I have no issue starting first.
All right, take it.
Okay, so we have a few questions prepared.
Well, that's right, so it doesn't matter, because you're going to question it. So
Yes. So, but just in the spirit of kind of, being casual, we'll ask the main questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask anything, any questions that you may have. maybe you want more information about a certain program or something, or part of your experience, so we'll go from there. So first, just as a foundation, I know everyone has their bios, but we really, from kind of in your own words, from your own perspective, please tell us how you got into your career field.
I started investment banking probably about 14 years ago, and I'll be quite honest with you, I got into it for basically monetary purposes. Anytime you read the newspaper, you see all these things about huge bonuses. I can tell you right now that that's a statistical number and it's not true. So there's a whole bunch of guys at the top making 20, 30 million, and a whole bunch of people at the bottom making a lot less. So it comes out to some, 500,000 or so everybody's making. It's not true. So basically, I went to Morgan Stanley. I started there in portfolio management. I wound up more in a corporate finance role as one of the beginners of the liquidity risk group. There was about 12 to 13 years. The work-life balance was terrible, and I had just begun a family. I had a young son, so I was looking to get into the comptroller's office. I knew that that's where a lot of the financial aspects of city government would be run. I initially applied to public finance. I applied there a few times, got in for a couple of interviews. The woman who heads that, Kara Kostick, actually forwarded my resume over to the Bureau of Asset Management, so I guess this is a little point where networking can be quite helpful, because I was actually looking into getting into public finance. She sent my resume over to the Bureau of Asset Management, and subsequently ended up there as financial risk manager. The pension fund is currently about $142 billion. It's spread across 5 main systems. There's a whole bunch of smaller systems as well, which further complicate things. In addition to my work at the Comptroller's Office, I'm also an officer on the Coast Guard. I actually just got activated probably about 4 days ago, so I was able to give my job a full 48 hours notice, which they were very happy with. I'm starting to run another phase of this Protect program. It deals basically with a game theory, so Bayesian Stackelberg model for patrol scheduling. So I just started that now. I'll be the project officer on that. That's basically how I got into public service, but I started out on Wall Street.
See, my background, I first started, I guess, in high school. I was a volunteer police officer with New York City Police Department. I was a auxiliary officer for approximately 2 to 3 years. I started here at John Jay 1990s, so like 23 years later, you come back and get your master's degree. I had a security background. I wound up working for a couple of retail establishments here in the city, and went on to the New York City Criminal Justice Agency. And as Professor Feldman had mentioned earlier, it is a private not-for-profit organization where you interview defendants who are newly arrested, and pretty much you're ascertaining their community ties so that the court can make an accurate decision, or at least make a decision in terms of whether or not to release someone on their own recognizance or to set bail. And I did that for a number of years. I got promoted, moved around between Manhattan and Queens. As they say in the business, if no better way to learn than OJT, on-the-job training, and I got plenty of it. I learned in Manhattan Criminal Court. I learned in Queens. Then I moved on to the Queens District Attorney's Office in 2000. Did a lot of work there, working community groups, working with the public. I've always had a passion. I always knew I wanted to work in the public eye. Always wanted to work in public service. And every way that I could excel, I did. I set those goals, and the opportunity came up with the Board of Corrections to become their Director of Field Operations. And ironically enough, it was actually around Christmas time, so I was actually hunting around Christmas. And it just happened to be in the perfect present, just after Christmas, to be part of the Board of Corrections and to serve as a Director of Field Operations. So even to this day, I'm still looking at what's the next role in the next couple of years in service to the public here in New York.
Very good, thank you. I think the strong undercurrent of public service runs throughout both of your careers, and I think it shows the transferability of the skills when you go from public or private to public, and to different government agencies. So I think that we see that with a lot of our MPA students, that they are flexible in terms of where they work, whether it's government, not-for-profit, corporate, but as long as they feel like they're working in the public service. So it definitely underscores that theme. So within your experience, what skills or talents are most essential to be effective in your job? And how do you feel that you personally learn those skills?
Specific to my career, obviously finance and accounting and spreadsheet technology would be imperative. Without those, you wouldn't get in the door. So those would be essential. What I'd consider separated would be a communication initiative and what I like to dub being comfortable with imperfection. So an example of communication, I had, like I said, 48 hours, gave my job notice. They had 2 days. I was supposed to meet with a group of DFS auditors. It's public knowledge that the pension funds are undergoing an audit right now. So I had 0 time to prepare, and I knew it was going to be more of an inquisition rather than an interview. So they moved it up to 1 day. You really have to know your profession, be comfortable with your knowledge, and be able to communicate that effectively. I mean, I had stated earlier when I got here that I view this as a learning opportunity. I don't think I've ever been completely comfortable getting up in front of anybody and just being able to, talk. But the more you do it, the better you become at it. Being able to communicate effectively is going to be imperative, regardless of what you do. In terms of initiative, I have another little story I always like to tell people. One of my first assignments at Second New York, which is on Staten Island, was for an audit, a financial audit. They brought me in because I had the background. I had my MBA at the time. I just finished a Certified Treasury Professional designation. Educationally speaking, I was probably the most qualified in the office, but being that I was the lowest rank, I was also the guy that had to mop out the trailer at the end of the day. So it's a task that you might think gets overlooked, but to have the initiative to play any part on the team is key. And the people I've noticed, maybe on the short term it doesn't happen, but in the long term, the people that are always looking for the glory positions probably won't make it to the top. You got to be willing to sometimes pull the slack and I guess mop the trailer, so to speak. And being comfortable with imperfection. Like I know I'm going to get up here and make mistakes, and that's just part of life. So just be comfortable with that, own that, and move forward with it. So I think if you can possess all 3 of those things, and obviously you'll have the right mental attitude to succeed, whether it be in the private or public sectors.
When I looked at this and I was thinking of this question, I was reminded of those daytime television ads, that say the toolbox, after you've learned and mastered a particular tool, it went into your toolbox, and then you graduated with it. And with that, I remember at every job along the way, and you mentioned this earlier, Mary, in terms of how the skills that you learn in one job transfers into another. There are those crucial transferable skills that you learn. And for me, I think there were 3 particular skills that I learned throughout the 20-year span of my career. Professionalism, integrity, and pride are like the cornerstones of my career. And then part of that diversity of repertoire of skills that you develop while you're working. As Charles alluded to, in terms of being a team player is crucial when you're working in any environment, whether you're working as part of a team, as part of line staff, or you're part of working as a team on the executive level. You have to be part and be able to be professional at that. Diplomacy is key. I'm quite sure there are times, Charles, you probably can attest to this, there are times you may not agree with people at times. And how do you be diplomatic in having that discourse and say, you know what, we can get over this obstacle and not be unprofessional in the workplace. And if you're a professional in the workplace, those who you work with, both internal to the organization and external to the organization, they remember that. They'll know that. They'll know your name. They'll say, you know what, I'm going to call Charles because I know I can call up on him. And I know that he will give me the level of work and product in terms of professionalism. Consistency is key in terms of integrity. If I've made mistakes many times, and as Charles alluded to, also being able to own up to it. Even as I sit here before you, I'm nervous, and I've done so many different speaking engagements, and even yet still you go through the whole process of preparation. And taking pride in your product, what you do every day, whether it's just a meeting with your executive or a meeting with your staff, is just really taking pride in your work. And sometimes the best skills are just learned as you learn them, as you learn the new jobs that you have or the new opportunities. As you go along, you learn, you master them, so to speak, and you know, it's always a constant evolutionary process in terms of what I've learned. And those are pretty much some of the most effective mechanisms and ways in which I've been able to adapt to any environment, even now on the board, where I had no clue learning what it is to be in a correctional environment. Having worked in a correctional environment in central booking, but one thing is to work pre-arraignment, another thing is work in a detention center, a jail setting, where now you're walking around inmates, how do you walk around, how do you carry yourself, how do you deal with other personnel from other agencies, and so pretty much it's all about diplomacy, professionalism, integrity, and pride. So that's a cornerstone.
As you were both speaking, this is not on the official list, but I was thinking about, you know, mentorship is so key when you're learning about the essential skills for a job. Has there been a mentor that you've had, whether it's been as part of your academic program or professionally, that you feel like has really guided you throughout the process?
It's going to sound like a dodge of the question, but I try to make everybody I can learn from a mentor. I think that's just the best way to do it. So if I can identify anything valuable in anybody, I don't want to call myself a parasite, but essentially that's what I am. And it's, you know, there's a lot of, some people are naturally funny, I'm not. So if I can pick that up and, you know, break a conversation and get information flowing that way. I mean, when you talk about diplomacy, just earlier, my lieutenant junior grade, I'd sent out an email. I'm an ensign in 01. So ahead of all the enlisted folks, but very junior on the officer chain, I sent around an email dictating what I'd like to accomplish in the coming weeks and the coming months. But he took me aside and said, you know, because I was dealing with a master chief, and the master chief takes years to become a master chief that's enlisted. Technically, I rank higher, but that wouldn't go over well. So he said, you know what, psychologically, you got to sort of flip it around and make it seem like, you know, the master chief can teach you. So try to get somebody excited to help you, and I think you'll have no problem. But doing that is actually
I would have to say throughout my career, I've always been a student of people in leadership positions, whether it was a direct line supervisor or someone in the public who was already an executive, whether it was the police department, correction department, whether it was in the human resources administration, anyone who was in an executive position. I'd always look at them and see how they act, both in public, throughout different situations in their career, whether it was both good and bad. And even those who I worked with very closely, one of my closest mentors was my last boss over at the DA's office. He was the executive assistant district attorney for the Special Prosecutions Division, and I worked under him for 12 years and also working under Judge Brown. And watching the district attorney, how he handled himself in public, watching the chief assistant district attorney handle himself with executive staff, having to lead a large office, watching my own executive having to watch and direct a very small division within the office, and how each one had to work within certain constructs of their authority, and to be able to, despite no matter what happened in the press, no matter what was happening internal or external, how they handled themselves under those conditions. So I'm always looking at people in leadership positions. And, the last one has been my former boss for the last 12 years. And now my current two bosses now, I look at them as what they have done both in public sector, also in private practice.
Very good. So everyone take that to heart. Excellent. You know, changing track a little bit, thinking about your occupation, specifically your roles, whether it's, you know, for example, the Coast Guard or the Comptroller's Office, in what ways do you feel that it's changing? Just because with our students and alumni who are thinking about different career paths and applying, if they're up to date on kind of the newest developments, the necessities for that role, what skills and knowledge they should have, it can really prepare them, you know, to apply in a very successful way.
Good. Before I answer the question, does anybody have any finance background or military background? I just want to gauge it before. Finance. Okay, so you'd be well.
Military, not so much finance.
Okay. All right, so I'll talk about the Comptroller's Office first. In terms of the pension fund, I just want to give a very quick, brief overview of how it actually runs, you know, how we set our targets. So essentially what happens is the actuary, Bob North, who's the current actuary for the city, he'll set our discount rate, which is essentially our return target. With that return target, our consultant, combined consultant, will then do an asset allocation analysis. And with that asset allocation analysis, they'll determine how much we should invest in certain asset classes to achieve, you know, the return that was stipulated by the actuary. What complicates that is that there's also an obscure law. It's a basket clause law. That's New York state law, because we're ultimately governed by state law. It's called the basket clause, and it limits what you can invest in. So we have a very structured, legally structured approach to investing. That's our current state. The industry is changing such that pension funds are becoming much more evolved. Canadian pension funds, for example, are, shall I say, much more enlightened than we are. There's Canadian pension funds that actually own sports teams. They do a lot of internal trading on their own. They have huge back offices to process the trades and do the P&L and all the different back office support functions that are needed. So the industry is sort of migrating towards this internal management approach. Now I know about a year ago, Mayor Bloomberg and John Liu, the current comptroller, got together at a press conference, and they basically they wanted to initiate a move towards spinning the Bureau of Asset Management out of the Comptroller's Office, thereby limiting political influence, which would be a good idea, and two, to try to move towards what people have said is more progressive form of internal management. Right now, we do not manage any assets internally. What that means is that we go out and essentially interview portfolio managers in all different asset classes. And then, with the board's consent, the Bureau of Asset Management provides advice to the boards. The boards ultimately have authority to then go in and say, yes, you can make that investment. I did all the forecasting for that analysis. While there was some consensus that it would be a good idea, it ultimately never came to fruition, but the industry is moving in that direction. With respect to the military, and when I say the military, I speak from Coast Guard perspective. Now, the Coast Guard is unique such that it's the only agency that falls under Title 14 of the U.S. Code as well as Title 10 of the U.S. Code. Now, what does that mean to a layman? Title 10 is a more militaristic. Title 14 is law enforcement, so the Coast Guard can actually arrest you in certain circumstances. Now, from a reserve perspective, because we respond to all different events, whether it be the earthquake in Haiti or the oil spill, ICS, the Incident Command System, has become, basically it's implemented everywhere. And what the Incident Command System is, it's a structured approach to dealing with a certain catastrophic scenario. So there's, I didn't make this up, it's called the planning P, and it's literally a cycle. Every day is spelled out by what you have to do. And within that construct, there's all different roles that have to be played. So I just took an operations section chief course with the New York Wildfire Academy maybe a few weeks ago. Now, operations section chief would plan the operations. You have a logistics aspect to that. Logistics section chief, they do the logistical aspects. So it's a really well-defined structure to report to a response, and then try to mitigate any further scenarios stemming from that response. So that's become very big. I know that the Coast Guard, or former Coast Guard, retired now and working for consultants, big consultancies, had went down to Brazil and actually taught the Brazilian National Police ICS command structure so they could implement it for the Pope's visit and the World Cup, I believe, is going to go on there, but I'm not a soccer fan. So. But so there's lots of different things happening in the industry, in both industries.
Well, in terms of how my occupation, in terms of how things are changing for us, I just have to say a little bit about the uniqueness of the oversight role that the Board of Corrections has over the Department of Correction, because it's very unique. It's unlike in other jurisdictions. The Board of Correction has oversight over the department concerning the conditions of confinement for all inmates, sentenced inmates, and detainees who are pending trial in custody, in the custody of the Department of Corrections. So there are several levels of standards of care. There is a standard, there's the normal standard, and there's the medical health care standard, and there's the mental health standard. Each one spells out in terms of what the department must provide for an inmate or a detainee. They must be provided with the appropriate clothing, if they're being provided with facility clothing, if they're being provided with their bed sheets, pillows, socks. If they're indigent inmates without clothing, then they're provided clothing. Medical care, that they're seen by medical staff within the first 24 hours of coming into the custody of the Department of Corrections. If they have pre-existing health conditions, that medication that they were given out in their communities is continued while under the custody of the Department of Corrections. If they're under psychiatric care, also, that also is also being maintained. And so as these are unique role, because you have the Department of Investigation, which handles the criminal oversight of the department in terms of corruption and in terms of criminal acts against inmates and staff. Then the department has its own internal investigation division, which investigates staff. And you have the gang intel unit, which pretty much investigates all inmate crimes against staff. And then we have the department, and then we have the Board of Correction, which oversees the entire department with regards to that. So there a little bit of overlap in each one, but the uniqueness of our oversight is pretty unique just to us here in New York City. In other jurisdictions, we have jail inspectors, and they do pretty much the same thing that we do in terms of monitoring conditions of confinement, facility, in terms of how the facility is run, how is the facility conditions are, in terms of plumbing, in terms of paint, issues such as that. And these are some of the uniqueness of the role that we have currently. And now the emerging challenges and changes in the conditions of confinement. Currently, the Board of Correction is exploring rulemaking on changing, adding additional rules concerning those inmates who are mentally ill and adolescents who are in solitary confinement. Prior to the enactment or the process of rulemaking, an inmate who had committed an infraction in violation of the departmental rule or regulation, if serious enough, would wind up in solitary confinement for a period of time. And if that person had a mental illness, that person would go to a specific housing area called the Maui. And there they would go there for a long period of time, both adolescents and adult inmates. And unfortunately, for those who are in solitary confinement, you do become to decompensate. There are so many issues that go on for someone who does not have a mental illness, one having depression, suicidal ideations. And this is just present in someone who does not have a mental illness. Someone who has a mental illness is much more perverse, much more pervasive. And there have been situations and incidents where inmates have committed self-harm gestures. Some have committed suicide because they could not no longer take being confined in such condition. So what we are now embarking now with the leadership of the board and its members is to enact a rulemaking process. And that process takes time. But nonetheless, it's pretty much looking at how we are going to change the manner in which the department should confine inmates, or at least place inmates who have a mental illness, to place them in a housing area where they can get therapeutic services as opposed to being confined in a cell for 23 hours a day. And that takes looking at different jurisdictions who are already embarking on that now, who have like places like San Francisco, who already have developed therapeutic environments for those inmates who have histories of mental illness, but yet still have violent histories. So pretty much that's where our emerging changes in terms of the occupation I have currently, which is what we're exploring currently.
So, you know, in tandem with that, I think you both spoke to this a little bit, but I think it ties in with the growth area in this field, in terms of where you see resources is necessary. You know, with the current economic times, it's really what we try to emphasize to students and our alums who are looking for a changing career path or getting into the job market is find out where you're needed, you know, where they are hiring, where there is growth. So within your respective fields, where do you see those areas of growth?
With respect to finance, and to be quite frank, what drove me away from Wall Street, not just me seeking a better work-life balance, was the fact that regulation has just become burdensome. Every little thing has become regulation. So no matter which function you're in, you're going to be reporting to myriad different agencies. At one point, I was controller of their $60 billion banking subsidiary, Morgan Stanley NA. Literally 1 week, we were just reporting to senior management, and no joke, the next week, because we switched from an investment bank to a bank holding company, we were literally reporting to the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, and the Federal Reserve. So, the shift was immediate, and it still exists. I mean, they report to everybody. So, because private sector banks are reporting to these agencies, there's probably going to be lots of opportunities in areas like FINRA, that's a self-regulating agency. I believe it's funded by the banks, and lots of different other agencies, from the Federal Reserve on down to the State Banking Commission. So that would be probably a good area to look for jobs in the area of finance.
Maybe the regulatory.
Yes, in the regulatory industry. In terms of the pension fund, we've made an active shift to get more involved in alternative investments. I got there roughly 2 years ago. The hedge fund program was in its infancy then. Hadn't really started. Now I believe we have about 11 different investments, so we've actively moved into hedge funds. We've scaled and tried to move into better private equity funds, and we've been also pretty active in the private real estate space as well. I know that we've made investments in Sandy-related investments, so things that benefit New York City. So alternative investments would be a great area to explore. And to get more information about that, or if your skill set isn't specific to that, there's a designation. It's a CAIHR, or Alternative Investment Analyst, which gives you the skill set to employ that type of knowledge in the field.
Is that a position that you can get without the background?
You probably wouldn't be able to get the position without a finance background. At a pension fund, however, if you have a fiscal policy background, because ultimately you're implementing policy. So for example, while we might like to get into alternative investments and expand into those more, we're ultimately governed by policy and law. So the basket clause could, and oftentimes does, limit what we can invest in. Some of that law is pretty, the law actually references railroad bonds, just to give you an idea of how old the law is. So anything over 10% international equity would be considered a basketable security. That doesn't necessarily make much sense. I mean, international equity investment is pretty plain vanilla nowadays, but that would bump up against our basket clause. And only 25% of our assets are allowed to be basketable. So we cannot go over that 25%. If we do, technically we're breaking New York State law.
Thinking about what particular areas of growth with regards to the field of regulatory regulations, I'm reminded something about something I was looking into yesterday. You know, the emerging, in terms of finances, financial sector itself, the anti-money laundering investigations positions are now a lot of financial institutions have a need for someone to be able to conduct these investigations. From a regulatory standpoint, even if it's not an area that you're familiar with, to be able to have that opportunity to kind of learn and get that exposure to the field itself. There are opportunities there for those who may not necessarily have a finance background, but there's also the opportunity to learn and be able to develop those skills over a period of time and move on up the chain of command. One of the areas for me in terms of growth has always been looking at training opportunities. Since having been with the Board of Correction, I've been looking at opportunities to train. I've done some training with McLaughlin, which is Mid-Atlantic, Great Lakes, Organized Crime Enforcement Network. I may be wrong on that acronym. But every year they do a gang conference, and that's why I make sure that I sit in on those conferences and kind of develop my own skill set. Definitely looking at how do I do my investigations better, how do I do my reports better. In terms of areas of growth, looking at other areas for regulatory, as we're more and more developed, as we're more and more growing into more accountability in terms of investment of public funds, there's going to be a regulation. Someone's going to be doing oversight, and getting the foot in the door is key. It may not be an area you're familiar with. It may not be an area that you may not be interested. But if you just give it a shot and learn from it, learn what you can learn from the pros and the cons. What are the takeaways that you can use that are transferable to the next stage in your career, to the next job? That's, for me, what's really in terms of determining the growth of the field. In terms of not just what I do in corrections, but also in any environment.
Very good. Thank you.
Can I just raise
Yes,
another
of
point
course.
that I think is pretty important, especially since we're talking about public administration. What I wanted to raise was, in the next couple of months, both administrations will be going through a transition. And I, having only been in the public sector for 2 years at the Comptroller's Office, I've never experienced one. But after talking with colleagues, what I understand is there's a lot of movement in job positions and openings. For example, I know for a fact that Bill de Blasio has a website where you can actually upload your resume directly to the website for job positions. So, and some of the higher level positions, which might be considered political appointee positions, those might be opened up. So now I think would be a good time to, actively investigate different, positions or potential opportunities at some of these agencies. Like I said, I'm not talking from experience because I've never been through a transition. But I would suspect that now, being that there is going to be changes in administrations, in both administrations, that there may be certain areas of opportunity there.
Actually, technically all three, although the public advocate's a technical office.
Public advocate too, and yes, it is a very tiny